Hi people! During the last few weeks, I found a few things that helped me improve my gameplay quite a bit, and so I figured I'd share them. These things might sound strange, but I'm trying to tell you things you haven't already heard loads of times before. So just bear with me and listen to the logic behind the tips, and then at the end you can decide for yourself whether you think they might be helpful or if you would just rather not. Just a quick note, these tips mainly focus on retail, although you could definitely use them in Classic as well. Number 1. Turn off floating combat text. So first of all, floating combat text is the numbers just above the target you're either healing or dealing damage to. So why would it help to turn this off? Well, there are essentially two reasons. First of all, the more information you expose your brain to, the more, let's call it brain power, the more brain power it has to spend process that information. Even if it's something you don't look at because you know it's irrelevant, your brain still has to spend some brain power to process it and identify that particular thing as irrelevant. If you don't know what something is, you can't tell whether it's important or not. And the more brain power you have to spend, the sooner you will be tired. That's why something very intense and hectic is more exhaustive than something calm and slow. When there's loads of impressions and information for the brain to process in a short period of time, it's gonna get tired quickly. This is something you want to avoid, and the best way to avoid this is to reduce the amount of information it needs to process. And the things you should remove are the unnecessary things. Sure, I mean, it's fun to look at your big numbers, but the number next to your name on the damage or healing meter will increase if you remove the floating combat text. And it's even more fun bragging about your high numbers to other players than just looking at them yourself. And also, when there is a lot of information coming at you at once, that is when you're gonna get stressed. Now, besides the reduction in processing requirements, it also helps clean up your UI. If you're fighting a bunch of mobs and you further clog it up with a lot of numbers, it will be even more difficult to notice an important cast bar or some important AoE on the ground. I'm sure you will agree that the UI without the floating combat text, although looking a bit weird, also looks more clean than the UI with the floating combat text. Now, should you want to test this out and turn off your combat text, you need to use these console commands. In order to turn it back on, write the same thing except with a 1 at the end, and for doing the same thing with healing numbers, use this instead. And I'll make sure to have these commands in the description below. Also note that you cannot turn on floating combat text for healing in Classic, because that just isn't a part of the game. And so we move on to number 2. Stand up. When sitting, especially for a longer period of time, we tend to worsen our posture and almost lie down in the chair after a while. And regardless of how we sit, heart rate will go down and we become more tired as time passes. If the body isn't activated, it kind of goes into sleepy mode. And in that state, we of course become less focused, less alert, and have slower reaction times. The best way to avoid the problems from sitting down for longer periods of time is to simply not sit down. It's not impossible to fall asleep while standing up, but it is a lot harder. I found that when I started standing up while at the computer, I was able to be more awake and alert, to focus more and react faster to what was happening in game. I also didn't become tired when at the computer in the same way that I used to be when I was sitting down. There are also a bunch of nice positive health effects from just standing up if you're usually sitting down a lot in everyday life, but that is another thing. And this is also something that isn't as easily done as just writing a command in game, but if you have the option to raise your desk or maybe have the screen, keyboard and mouse on a shelf, it could be worth trying out. But if you aren't used to standing up for longer periods of time, you will get some ache in your abdomen, your legs and your feet as your body's getting used to standing up way more. But your body will adapt and in a few days you won't feel that ache anymore. Finally, don't focus too much on anything. Whenever in a hectic and intense situation, people tend to die. And the reason why is often that they miss a lethal AoE effect that they needed to avoid, or they miss an important interrupt. When this happened, the reason tends to be that they were too focused on one thing and couldn't notice the other things that was going on at the same time. On basically every raid boss where me and my guilds have been progressing, the reason why we were stuck in the first place was because people had difficulties both doing their rotation and following the new tactics at the same time. They forget, or they didn't notice, or they were too focused on something else. They're not used to doing this new particular thing, and so they have to think about it in a more conscious manner. It's kind of like trying to play a new class when you've only been reading about the rotation and never practiced it. Or when you were learning to drive. You know what to do, but you haven't automated the things, and conscious thought is slower than unconscious automated thought. When you play your main, you probably don't think much at all about your rotation. You know exactly what will happen and what you need to do to react to it properly, and when you need to do what. That allows you to focus more on the things around you. When you are in a stressful situation, it's important not to stare yourself blind on one particular thing. You might focus too much on your action bar and miss the huge cast about to blast you in the face. Or you might fail to interrupt the cast bar because you never looked up and saw the damn thing. Often when I'm doing a hard fight on my priest, I don't even focus my vision on a particular thing. I just stare somewhere and try and see the things happening in my peripheral vision. Like when you're killing the ads on Sardonathus and people have to avoid the pools. If you manage to grip someone who messed up the pools because they were too focused on some other thing, you can save a combat juice, which is immensely helpful. To be able to do this grip and not get hit by the pools myself, I, like mentioned, try and just use peripheral vision. As soon as I notice movement above the rest of the players, I start focusing on what's happening over there. It's usually a guy that's about to get blown off, and then I spam my life grip mouse over macro. Sometimes it works, in which case I become the MVP, and in some cases, well, there was nothing I could do anyway. It really was the other player's fault. Basically, there are often situations in the game where you have to do 2 or more things simultaneously, and that is difficult, and the best way to succeed at such a task is to not focus too much on anything, but instead try and focus on getting the full picture. Because I can grip people on my priest, I can save them if they're about to mess up mechanics, so that's absolutely something I want to do. And the best way, like said, to be able to focus on several things at once is to not focus too much on any one of them. I not only want to do the mechanics properly myself, I want to look around to ensure the rest of the players are doing it properly as well. Otherwise, it's time to use Leap of Faith. Another perfect example is the traps on Artificer Psymok. Often a healer will be too focused on the raid frames that they will fail to see where they're standing and don't notice the trap that spawned right beneath them. Either they're now gonna get stuck as the trap activates, or hopefully I can just grip them out of it and nothing bad happens. And so to recuperate. You wanna minimize the amount of things your brain has to process, for example by turning off floating combat text. This is partly to keep you from getting stressed and partly to make it easier to make the right decisions and notice all the details that you want to see. Stand up in front of your computer. This will help you stay awake and alert to what's happening. Finally, don't focus too much on anything. Instead, focus on the whole thing. Often you have to do several things at once, and doing all of them decently or even kind of bad is infinitely better than doing one of them great and then dying because you failed on all the other ones. And so these were the tips I had to offer you for now. I hope you found them interesting and might give them a go yourself. And sure to press the like into a subscribe. Anyway, this was all from me for now. I'll be back soon with another video, and until then, see ya!